April 10, 1912. Southampton Harbor is electric. The air buzzes with excitement, dwarfed by the sheer scale of the vessel before us, the RMS Titanic. She's not just a ship. She's a floating palace, a monument of steel and smoke, with 4 colossal funnels tearing through the sky. A word echoes through the crowd, a confident whisper that becomes a roar, unsinkable. Clutching his mother's hand amidst the throng is 12-year-old Samuel Carter. They are third-class passengers, but their dreams are first class. They're bound for New York, for a new life in America where his father is already waiting in Chicago. For Samuel, his chest isn't just filled with air, but with pure, unfiltered hope. The ship's horn lets out a thunderous blast that seems to shake the very foundations of the harbor. A sea of hands waves goodbye from the shore as the Titanic, with a slow, deliberate grace, begins to pull away. The cheers of the crowd follow them, echoing across the water. Samuel leans over the railing, the world stretching out before him, vast and endless. He feels small, but a thrill courses through him. This is the beginning of everything. Up on the higher decks, first-class passengers stroll along elegant promenades. Through the windows, Samuel can see the glint of crystal chandeliers and hear the faint, sophisticated notes of a string quartet drifting through the corridors. Life in third class is simpler, but it's no less joyful. Laughter fills the common rooms, and children's feet patter down below deck. Samuel makes friends quickly. The narrow hallways of the lower decks become their personal kingdom, a labyrinth for games of chase and adventure. The days melt into one another, peaceful and serene. The Atlantic is a canvas of brilliant blue, stretching to the horizon in every direction. The ship's officers walk with a proud swagger, boasting of their speed. "We're making record time," they say, their voices filled with the confidence of men commanding an unsinkable giant. But as the Titanic cuts through the waves, something else is traveling too. Warnings, sent by wireless telegraph, speak of ice fields ahead. Some messages are delivered, some are overlooked, dismissed in the rush to set a new transatlantic record. The air grows colder. The water darkens. It is now April 14th, 1912, a Sunday. Church services are held across the ship, a moment of quiet reflection before the final, frantic hours. Samuel sits in a corner and writes a letter to his father. Simple, hopeful words. "We'll see you soon." That night, the sky is a blanket of sharp, glittering stars. But there is no moon. The sea is unnaturally calm, like a sheet of black glass. An eerie, profound darkness envelops the ship. Then, at 11:40 p.m., it happens. A sudden, jarring shudder runs the length of the hull. It's not a crash, but a long, grinding scrape, like a giant hand dragging its nails along the ship's side. In his bunk, Samuel freezes. For a moment, there is only silence. Then, a low hum of confusion begins to build in the distance. Stewards appear, their faces tight, walking quickly through the corridors with a forced calm. "Please return to your cabins," they instruct, but their eyes betray a deeper worry. Passengers begin to whisper, their voices laced with a nervous energy. Samuel's mother pulls her coat tighter around her shoulders, her expression grim. "We're going upstairs," she says, her voice firm. They join a stream of people climbing the endless staircases. As they emerge onto the open deck, the freezing night air hits them like a physical blow. And there, Scattered across the wooden planks are chunks of ice. Some of the men are laughing nervously, trying to make light of it. Just a little scrape, one says, kicking a piece of ice. It's nothing. But Samuel sees it. A subtle, almost imperceptible change. The ship is tilting. He watches as crewmen begin to uncover the lifeboats, their movements swift and practiced. Officers are speaking in low, urgent tones, their words snatched by the wind. And then he hears the phrase that will define the night. Women and children first. The quiet fear begins to curdle into something else. In third class, the maze of corridors and locked gates becomes a trap. The passages grow crowded, the air thick with rising panic. And then, a strange, surreal sound cuts through the growing chaos. The ship's band has assembled on deck. They begin to play, their soft music a fragile defense against the biting cold and the encroaching dread. Samuel grips his mother's hand, his knuckles white. "Mama, is the ship sinking?" he asks, his voice barely a whisper. She forces a smile, a mask of reassurance that doesn't quite reach her terrified eyes. "No, sweetheart. Everything will be fine." But it's a lie, and they both know it. Below them, deep in the belly of the ship, the Atlantic is pouring in. The bow is dipping deeper, pulled down by the weight of the icy water. The truth is cold, brutal, and unavoidable. The unsinkable ship is dying, and the long, dark night has only just begun. The piercing cold grew even sharper, each breath turning to a cloud of frost against the moonless sky. A subtle but unmistakable tilt began to pull the grand deck forward. The once calm and orderly movements of the crew had transformed into a hurried, frantic rush. Their voices, once reassuring, now carried a sharp edge of urgency. Women and children only. The command echoed across the deck, cutting through the rising murmur of confusion and fear. Lifeboats, like ghostly white pods, swung out over the vast, dark emptiness of the Atlantic. Yet, even as these preparations began, a sense of disbelief still clung to many. "This ship is unsinkable," they'd say, their words a fragile shield against the encroaching reality. But far below, in the ship's metallic heart, the icy water crept ever onward. It was a silent, inevitable invasion. Samuel held his mother's hand, his small fingers gripping hers with all his might. The crowd around them was swelling, becoming a dense, anxious mass of people. Families from third class, their faces etched with worry, were finally pushing their way up from the lower decks, the gates that had held them back now thrown open. The thin veneer of patience was cracking, replaced by the raw beginnings of panic. A sudden flash lit up the night as a flare shot into the sky, its red light burning a desperate, fleeting warning against the backdrop of indifferent stars. Through it all, the ship's band played on, their calm, elegant music a surreal counterpoint to the rising terror. The first lifeboats were being loaded, but the officers, still not grasping the full extent of the catastrophe, sent them down half full. The true danger hadn't yet registered in the collective consciousness. A deep, groaning sound resonated from the very bones of the ship, the sound of immense metal straining under an impossible pressure. Samuel felt the slope of the deck increase, the tilt becoming more pronounced. People stumbled, their balance lost on the slanting floor. A woman's cry pierced the air as she pleaded for her husband, who was being held back by a stern-faced crewman. "Stay with the men," was the unyielding reply. Samuel's mother knelt before him, her eyes shimmering with a fear he had never seen before. "If we're separated," she began, her voice trembling, unable to finish the terrible thought. A lifeboat was being prepared nearby, swaying just inches from the deck railing. Women and children. The call came again, more insistent this time. A crewman's hand fell on Samuel's shoulder. "How old are you, son?" "12, he answered, his voice small. He was immediately pushed toward the boat, his mother following close behind, her hand a steadying presence on his back. But then, in a sudden, chaotic surge, a wave of boaties pressed forward, a human tide of desperation. Strong hands pulled, voices shouted, and in the confusion, Samuel lost his mother's grip. "Mama!" he cried out, but the overwhelming noise of the crowd swallowed his voice whole. A crewman, seeing his small frame, lifted him effortlessly and deposited him into the lifeboat. He immediately tried to scramble back out, his heart pounding with a new, terrifying panic. "My mother's still there," he shouted, his voice cracking. For a moment, the officer in charge of the boat hesitated, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene on the deck. He spotted her, her face a mask of frantic searching. She was being shoved forward, fighting her way through the throng. For one precious second, their eyes met across the divide. A wave of pure relief washed over Samuel, but it was just as quickly stolen. Another surge of passengers, more desperate than the last, swept her away, and she disappeared back into the anonymous, struggling crowd. The lifeboat began to lower. "No, stop," Samuel screamed, his voice raw with anguish. The heavy ropes creaked and groaned as the boat descended, the dark, churning sea rising up to meet them. His mother was still on the deck of the sinking ship. By now, the Titanic's bow was dipping sharply, the angle of the deck becoming impossibly steep. The remaining passengers began a frantic scramble toward the stern, the highest point left above the water. The sounds of destruction grew louder. Heavy deck chairs slid across the polished floors, crashing into railings. Below deck, the shattering of 1,000 dishes echoed like a final, tragic symphony. The band played one last, haunting hymn, a melody of quiet resignation. Then, silence from the musicians. The ship's magnificent lights, which had turned the vessel into a floating palace of brilliance, began to flicker. One by one, they went out, plunging the giant into an almost complete darkness. And then came the sound, a terrible, deafening roar that seemed to tear the very fabric of the night. It was the sound of the hull splitting apart, the tortured scream of steel in its death agony. The mighty Titanic broke in two. The bow, heavy with water, plunged downward, disappearing beneath the waves. The stern, for a moment, was lifted high into the sky, a final, defiant silhouette against the stars, with hundreds of souls clinging desperately to its rails and rigging. Then, it too began its final descent, slipping quietly beneath the ocean's surface. The Atlantic closed over the last remnants of the great ship, in the sudden, profound silence that followed the sinking. A new sound arose, the collective cry of over 1,000 people, adrift in the freezing, dark water. And in that tiny, half-empty lifeboat, Samuel's world shattered, sinking with the ship into the icy depths below. The ocean was an endless expanse of black, a void so deep and cold it seemed to swallow sound itself. The initial screams, sharp and desperate, didn't last long. The piercing cold stole voices with brutal efficiency. Samuel's lifeboat, a tiny, fragile shell, rocked violently in the swell. Around him, women wept softly, their grief a quiet, constant murmur. Others just stared, their faces masks of shock, looking out at the darkness where the unsinkable ship had just been. Small mountains of ice floated by like silent, white ghosts. The Titanic was gone. Only the cold, indifferent stars remained overhead, scattered across the night sky like diamond dust. Samuel, small and shivering, scanned the inky blackness, his eyes straining to see something, anything. "Mama?" he shouted again, his voice cracking, swallowed by the vastness. No answer came back, just the gentle slap of water against the hull. A woman beside him, a stranger, gently wrapped a thick wool blanket around his shoulders. It was a kind gesture, but it did little to ward off the profound, bone-deep chill. The water was a lethal 28 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature no one could survive for long. The cries for help that had once filled the air began to fade, one by one, into an eerie, final silence. The man in charge of their lifeboat, the captain, refused to turn back towards the cries. "We'll be swamped," he warned, his voice tight with fear. "They'll pull us all under." Samuel felt a hot surge of hatred for him in that moment. How could he be so cruel? But fear was the true captain of this night, a cold, ruthless master that ruled everyone in the boat. The hours crawled by, each minute an eternity. The cold was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on them, seemingly without end. Then, just as despair began to feel permanent, a light appeared. It was faint at first, a distant spark on the horizon. But then it grew brighter, steadier. A flicker of hope ignited in the frozen hearts of the survivors. "A ship," someone cried out, their voice hoarse with a mixture of disbelief and relief. It was the RMS Carpathia. Having received the Titanic's distress call, she was racing through the treacherous ice fields. Her engines pushed far beyond their normal limits, a beacon of salvation in the desolate night. By 4 a.m., the rescue operation was underway. The Carpathia loomed beside them, a towering wall of steel and light. Ropes were lowered, and the survivors, weak and numb, began the slow, agonizing climb up the rope ladders. Samuel could barely feel his hands. His fingers were stiff and useless. A pair of strong sailors reached down, lifting him gently over the railing and onto the solid deck. The sudden warmth was a shock to his frozen skin. He was wrapped in more blankets, and someone pressed a cup of hot, steaming broth into his hands. All around him, there was the sound of quiet, exhausted sobbing. He looked at every face, his eyes darting around, searching for the one that mattered most. Not her, not yet. More lifeboats kept arriving, pulling alongside the Carpathia. Each one seemed to carry fewer people than the last. Some, tragically, carried none who were still alive. As the first rays of dawn broke across the horizon, the sun finally rose, illuminating a scene of cruel, serene beauty. Massive icebergs, the silent assassins of the night, floated peacefully in the calm water. The surface was littered with debris, broken pieces of wood, deck chairs, and empty life jackets bobbing gently on the waves. There was only silence where the magnificent giant once stood. In total, 705 souls were saved. More than 1,500 were lost to the icy depths. Samuel sat alone on the deck, wrapped in his blanket, feeling smaller and more lost than he ever had in his life. A crew member began calling out names, trying to create a list of the survivors. Across the deck, families were being reunited, their reunions marked by tears of profound joy and relief. Samuel waited, his heart a tight knot of desperate hope. And then he heard it. A voice calling a name, Mrs. Carter. His heart stopped. He spun around, his eyes wide, and there she was. Wrapped in blankets, her face pale, her body shaking from the cold, but she was alive. He ran, stumbling across the deck and into her arms. She held him, clutching him with a strength born of terror and relief, as if she would never, ever let go again. Neither of them spoke for a long, long time. Words felt too small, too insignificant for the magnitude of what they had survived. On April 18, 1912, the skyline of New York Harbor appeared through a gray, somber mist. For Samuel and his mother, and for the other survivors, a new life was beginning, one that would be forever marked by the sea. A life reclaimed from the cold, dark waters of that unforgettable night. Thanks for watching. If you found this story moving, please consider subscribing for more tales from history.